Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into a stack of sources centered around a specific period and a very specific lens, the decisions made by George W. Bush, as presented in these excerpts from his memoir, Decision Points.
Right. And it's interesting because, as you said, it's not really a strict autobiography. It's more thematic, structured around these big decisions or maybe groups of related choices from his life and presidency.
Exactly. So our mission here is to kind of go through this material, pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights, by following that thread of decision-making.
Yeah, looking at the context, the challenges he faced, the advice he got, and the rationale he gives for those choices, right?
Well,
All based strictly on what's in these pages.
it's about seeing the job and the path to the job through his eyes, based only on the source.
And he actually says right at the start how he approached writing it. He mentions being inspired by Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like Grant, he decided, look, this isn't going to be an exhaustive play-by-play. It's going to focus specifically on the decisions. He wanted it to flow thematically, not just, year by year. Gives it a pretty distinct feel.
Okay, so where does it start? Early life.
It does. It shares these early life anecdotes that the book argues shaped his perspective. Growing up in Midland, Texas, for instance, it's described really vividly. You get the sense of a place with a real independent, almost entrepreneurial vibe. There was competition, sure, but also this strong community feel.
Mhm.
He makes a point of mentioning the different jobs his friends' parents had, like one was a painter, another a surgeon, someone else poured cement, just a mix.
Yeah.
And this little detail I found fascinating. He actually met Laura's father years before he ever met Laura herself.
No kidding.
How was just because he was a home builder living nearby in Midland. Small town connection, I guess.
Wow. That sense of place, that community, sounds like it was really formative.
Yeah.
And family influence, too. That seems like a big theme early on.
Oh, definitely. Learning his dad's story from old childhood scrapbooks, seeing photos and notes about, pilot training in World War II, playing in the College World Series. There's even a picture with Babe Ruth.
Huh, really?
Yeah, and that really powerful detail about the piece of rubber from the raft that saved his dad's life after he was shot down in the Pacific, apparently they kept it. A tangible reminder.
Goodness. That's intense.
Absolutely. And the dynamic with his parents comes through really strongly. His dad's sense of humor. There's an airplane joke mentioned in all the nicknames.
Mm-hmm.
Junie, Whitey, Bake. He called his mother the Silver Fox.
Silver Fox, okay.
And his mother, she's described as having this feisty and irreverent streak. He talks about moments where he tried to show his independence, but the love for his family was clearly always there. There's a great, really relatable family story about his daughter Jenna teasing him during the governor's race. Right in front of the TV cameras, she brings up him shooting a killdeer, and you get his reaction.
Oh, you can just picture that moment, can't you? The cringe.
Totally. And then the book gets into something much heavier, the profound sadness of losing his sister Robin when he was young.
Right.
He describes it as being sad, too, in a 7-year-old way, sad about losing her, but also seeing his parents' pain. He notes it took years for him to really grasp the depth of their grief.
That makes sense.
And that period after she died, it created this new closeness with his mother. He remembers staying inside with her instead of going out to play with the neighborhood kids.
That's touching. So moving on to his education, Andover is mentioned.
Yeah, Andover is presented as a really key experience, especially for social adjustment, which he says happened faster than the academic side, at least at first.
Okay.
He found a small group of fellow Texans there, including Clay Johnson, who became a lifelong friend. But he also broadened his circle, saying it was good for a guy who was interested in people. And it was apparently there he discovered he was a natural organizer. He appointed himself commissioner of the Stickball League.
Commissioner of Stickball.
Yeah, called himself Tweed's Bush even, devised elaborate rules, a whole playoff system, and famously, no wild card teams allowed. A purist, even then.
Definitely laying down the law early. What about Yale? His acceptance story is interesting too, right?
It is. He says he doubted he'd get in. His grades and scores were, quote, respectable, but behind many of the other applicants. He even mentions a dean advising him to get some good insurance, like applying to the UT Austin Plan 2 program as a backup.
So he was surprised when he got in.
Totally stunned by the thick Yale envelope, apparently. He attributes getting in largely to a strong recommendation letter from a Mr. Lyons. And then deciding to room with Clay Johnson, his friend from Andover and Midland, kind of sealed the deal.
So looking at this whole early section, this focus on foundations.
Hmm.
The book seems to be building a case, doesn't it? That these experiences, that Midland spirit, the family stuff, both good and bad, and over Yale, even stickball commissioner, it all sets a stage.
Exactly. The insight here, as it's presented, is how all these seemingly different bits from childhood and adolescence can subtly shape how a person approaches big choices later on.
It does make you think, doesn't it?
Yeah,
How do your own early experiences, your family, shape how you tackle challenges now?
for sure. And that foundation clearly carries forward. The sources then shift to his life after college, specifically moving back to West Texas to Midland in 1975.
Right, packing up the old cutlass, ready to learn the oil business, as the book puts it.
And seeking out mentors seems to have been a key step right away. He mentions a guy named Boyd Laughlin, Loophole, who set up a meeting with Buzz Mills described as big man with a crew cut, and Ralph Way, this cigar-chomping man.
Sounds like characters.
Definitely. He found them playing gin rummy, apparently betting more money than he even had at the time. Seems like his real-world business education kicked off right there.
And it was around this time, back in Midland, that he met Laura.
Exactly. At a dinner party, he describes meeting her, notes her. Short game was a little shaky, but she was a lot of fun to be around.
Oh, okay.
But the connection, he says, was immediate. Felt like a perfect match. He's the talker, she's the listener. He's restless, she's calm. He gets carried away, she's practical. That kind of dynamic.
Yin and yang.
Pretty much. He apparently missed her so much after just one night visiting her in Austin that he flew straight back from Kennebunkport the very next morning just to be with her.
Wow, that was fast.
It really was. And the source makes a point of highlighting Laura's strength, especially during her high-risk pregnancy with the twins.
Yeah, that must have been stressful.
He says he worried a lot, remembering his mother's earlier miscarriage and the pain after Robin's death. But he recalls Laura just looking at him, very calm, and saying with total certainty, "George, I am going to bring these girls into the world. They will be born healthy." He calls her one tough soul.
That's quite a statement.
And then getting that call from the doctor, Dr. James Boyd, saying the twins would be born the next day, 5 weeks early, but they were ultimately fine. Just a huge relief.
And faith seems to become really important during this period, too, according to the book.
Very significant and described very personally. He talks about this pivotal dinner in Maine where Billy Graham was. Graham apparently planted a seed, explaining the idea that you can't earn God's love, that salvation comes through grace by embracing Christ. Graham gave him a copy of the Living Bible with an inscription from Philippians. And this led him to start attending a community Bible study back in Midland with friends Don Evans and Don Jones.
And this ties into another huge personal decision around that time, right? Quitting drinking.
It seems directly linked in the narrative, yeah.
Yeah.
He describes waking up one morning with a mean hangover, barely remembering the night before.
We've all been there. Maybe not that bad, hopefully.
Right. But he goes for a jog, his head clear, and he describes these cross currents in his life coming into focus. He'd been praying, asking God how to better reflect his will, and his scripture readings, he says, really clarified things about temptation and selfishness.
So he saw drinking as getting in the way of that.
Exactly. He realized drinking was making him put himself ahead of others, especially his family. He writes, "Faith showed me a way out, and that he knew he could count on the grace of God. It was apparently right there on that jog that he made up my mind. I was done drinking."
Just like that. A moment of decision.
That's how it's presented. He even references a West Texas saying, last night he thought he was a 10, when in fact he was an ass, and admits, yeah, that applied to him sometimes.
Self-awareness there.
He mentions one specific low point, asking a boozy question to a beautiful friend of his parents in Maine. The book definitely connects the change brought by his faith directly to making that decision to stop drinking by 1986. A conscious choice rooted in these changing values.
So from personal decisions to public life, the book then moves to his first run for office, right? That 1978 congressional race.
Yeah, his first shot. He and Laura moved temporarily to Lubbock to campaign, spent tons of hours in the car together. They apparently called it our honeymoon, which is kind of funny.
A political honeymoon?
Right. He notes Laura was just a natural campaigner because she was so genuine. He ended up losing that race to Kent Hance.
But they became friends afterwards.
Yeah, interestingly enough. Became good friends. He calls Hance the only politician ever to beat me. And he includes Hance's claim that, hey, without that loss, Bush never would have become president. Bush adds, he's probably right. Reflecting on how that early failure shaped him.
That's a good perspective. And he worked on his dad's campaigns, too.
Oh, yeah, big time. Filled with pride, he says. He recounts the 1980 loss to Reagan, then the 1984 win, and learning lessons, especially from his dad's 1992 campaign, the famous Read My Lips pledge reversal, which he saw lead to an eroding base.
A tough lesson in politics.
For sure. And he reflects on the irony that his dad's defeat in 92, actually, kind of unexpectedly, created openings for both him and his brother Jeb to run for office. He doubts he would have run for governor or president if his dad had won re-election in 92.
Wow, interesting political calculus there, which sets the stage for his own run for governor in 1994.
Exactly. He describes feeling this drive to do more with my life, definitely inspired by the family tradition of service his father, his grandfather. He had financial security by then. And he mentions watching his dad succeed in the biggest arena and wanting to find out if he, too, had what it took to join him. So he sought advice from Karl Rove.
Karl Rove. When did they first meet?
Way back in 1973, apparently. He describes Rove as different from the usual campus politicos, calls him like a political mad scientist, intellectual, funny, and overflowing with energy and ideas. Clearly saw him as a key advisor early on.
And building the campaign team, that was crucial.
Yeah, the book highlights two hires in particular. Joe Albo, as campaign manager, described physically, an imposing 6'4" man with a flat top and the bearing of a drill sergeant.
Quite the image.
And Karen Hughes as communications director. He met her at a state party convention, and his immediate impression was this woman was in charge. Made sense, he notes, when she mentioned her father was a 2-star general. These hires are presented as really pivotal decisions.
So, his time as Texas governor. The book highlights delivering on his promises.
Yeah, his 4 stated priorities. It points to passing the largest tax cut in Texas history and making it easier for kids in foster care to get adopted as key achievements.
Bipartisanship is mentioned too, right?
Definitely emphasized. Many laws passed had Democratic sponsors, and he mentions getting Bob Bullock's unexpected endorsement for his re-election. Bullock was actually the godfather of his opponent's children, a real political twist.
Wow, that's Texas politics for you. What about working relationships?
He describes working with Bullock, who apparently showed his cards, sometimes throwing the whole deck, versus Speaker Pete Laney, who was more low-key and kept his hand close to his vest. Different styles. Those weekly breakfasts, they had started off informal but evolved into important strategy sessions. Shows how those personal relationships really influenced the legislative decisions. He tells the story about Bullock calling him up, just unloading about tort reform, using a ton of expletives, then hanging up. Bush's reaction, he just laughed and laughed hard, sensing it was just a passing storm. An interesting way of handling conflict presented there.
So by 1998, he felt pretty good about his record.
Yeah, going into re-election, he felt confident, framed it as a validation of his decisions as governor.
And that confidence, plus that persistent feeling you mentioned, leads to the decision to run for president in 2000.
Right. Again, described as feeling that drive to test his skills, inspired by family, watching his dad on the biggest stage, and wanting to see if he had what it took to join him. The memoir positions it as more than just ambition. It's legacy, service, personal challenge.
Gotcha. The sources also touch on some challenges before the election, right? Give some insight into handling pressure.
Yeah, debate prep, for instance. He describes having an advice blackout, basically, filtering all suggestions through Karen Hughes. And he specifically rejected that generic, just be yourself advice, wanted to keep his head clear.
Makes sense. And then the DUI news breaking just days before the election.
Yeah, 5 days before. News of a DUI arrest from 25 years earlier. He'd thought about disclosing it years before for jury duty, but got excused. Then a reporter asks him about it outside the Austin courthouse. He says his heart just sank.
Oh, man. Terrible timing.
Right. He called Andy Card, they talked it over, and he made the decision to just confirm the story. Knew it could be damaging, felt exposed and vulnerable, presented as a really tough call under intense media pressure.
And election night 2000.
Oh,
The book describes that vividly.
Oh, yeah. Offers a real inside look at that extreme uncertainty, watching the returns in the governor's mansion with family, aides, everything turning on Florida, networks calling it, uncalling it.
Chaos.
Total chaos. Al Gore's gracious call conceding, then the incredibly awkward call taking it back, preparing to go out and address this freezing crowd waiting outside. He notes the exact moment the weight of it really sank in. Hours earlier, he was ready to just move on with his life if he lost. Now, suddenly he's preparing to be president, assuming Florida held. The shift was just stark.
Wow. So looking back at that whole path, Midland, Yale, business, governor, all the way to the brink of the presidency, the memoir really lays out how past experiences shaped him, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The family lessons, the mentors, the early campaign failures and successes, overcoming personal stuff like quitting drinking, the foundation as governor. It's all presented as building resilience, shaping his approach, getting him ready for what was next.
The insight seems to be how these personal history pieces are framed as crucial inputs for the decision-making that defines public life. Makes you think again, how have your experiences, setbacks included, the people who guided you, shaped your readiness for bigger things?
Definitely. And that personal journey leads right into the transition to president. Walking into the Oval Office for the first time, he describes seeing it, saying it looked like it was glowing.
Must have been quite a moment.
Yeah. And he mentions the personal touches he added right away. Paintings from Texas, the Alamo, a West Texas landscape, bluebonnets, a Tom Lee painting called Rio Grande, and another one, W.H.D. Corner's A Charge to Keep.
A charge to keep. That sounds significant.
It does. It echoes a Methodist hymn they sang at his first gubernatorial inauguration. Seems to reflect that idea of serving a cause larger than yourself, which is a theme presented in the source.
And the portrait he chose for the wall.
Lincoln. He explains the thinking. Number 41 hangs in my heart, meaning his father. 16 is on the wall. A nod to history and a specific kind of leadership.
Right. And the Resolute desk history is in there too.
Yeah, details about it being made from a British ship presented by Queen Victoria to President Hayes, just grounding the immense job in history and these personal connections.
And then everything changed. 9/11.
Yeah. The sources describe that as the defining moment, the sudden, jarring shift. He was focused on his domestic agenda. Laura was actually scheduled to testify on education reform that very morning.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
And then, instantly, he becomes a war president. The book calls it the most devastating surprise attack since Pearl Harbor, and the purpose of his presidency became crystal clear right then: to protect our people and defend our freedom. That's framed as the moment the core mission of his time in office was set.
So the initial response must have been incredibly pressured decisions.
Unimaginable pressure. He emphasizes the need to project calm, drawing on experience handling disasters back in Florida. The immediate tasks were sorting facts from the chaos, securing the nation, figuring out a strategy. He called Dick Cheney, who'd already been moved to the PEOC, the underground bunker.
Right, the Presidential Emergency Operations Center.
Exactly. Told Cheney he'd make decisions from Air Force One for now, count on him on the ground to coordinate things.
And crucial decisions were made right there, airborne.
Yeah, two really significant ones quickly. First, authorizing combat air patrols over major cities. He connects this back to his F-102 pilot training days, noting the chilling reality that now the potential targets were commercial airliners.
God, that's horrifying to think about.
It really is. The second thing was just the desperate attempts all morning to reach Laura. The line kept dropping. He admits he snapped at Andy Card out of frustration before finally, immense relief, hearing her voice, knowing she was safe after they landed.
Understandable frustration. Where did they land first?
Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. Described as a striking scene, F-16s from his old unit escorting them, the taxiway lined with bombers, a stark visual of the power he now had to wield.
Yeah.
He mentions the Secret Service rushing him into a vehicle and him telling the driver to slow down, joking, "Slow down, son, there are no terrorists on this base," saying it was probably the closest he came to death that day. A bit of gallows humor in that darkness.
Wow. Then into the PEOC.
Into the PEOC. Described with vivid detail the sound of the pressurized doors closing, bang, hiss. An enlisted man announcing an F-16 was squawking the wrong transponder. Just this tiny technical detail amid massive crisis.
Strange the things you notice.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
The CIA briefing confirmed bin Laden was responsible based on intelligence intercepts. And the NSC meeting that followed is presented as where this new kind of war was defined. No capital, no conventional armies. The strategy had to be about uncovering plots, tracking movements, cutting off money, denying safe havens, and recognizing the home front itself was now a battleground.
A whole new paradigm.
Totally. Putting America on a war footing is called one of the most important decisions of his presidency, right there in those initial hours and days.
And waging that new war meant big changes, like creating the Department of Homeland Security.
Right. The source says that after 9/11, it was just obvious the law enforcement approach to terrorism had failed. These weren't common criminals. This was war. He initially appointed Tom Ridge to coordinate efforts, but quickly realized the job was too huge for just a small White House office.
So consolidation was the answer.
That was the decision. Create the Department of Homeland Security, merging dozens of agencies. The example given for why this was needed is pretty stark. The INS apparently mailed visas to some of the 9/11 pilots in March 2002.
Months after the attack.
Yeah, called an egregious example of the fragmented system that justified the decision to consolidate.
Makes sense. But inherent in all this security focus was that tension, right?
Yeah.
Protecting people versus civil liberties.
Absolutely. The book presents military tribunals, for example, as striking the right balance upholding rule of law, but protecting the country from individuals framed as unlawful combatants. On intelligence and interrogation, the capture of Abu Zubaydah is mentioned Pakistani police, FBI, CIA help.
And the controversial interrogation program.
Yeah, the decision was made to implement the CIA program, which the book states he believed saved lives.
How does the book handle the controversy around that?
It notes he briefed a small, bipartisan group of lawmakers on it. Says at the time, some were actually concerned they weren't pushing hard enough. But years later, they became fierce critics, charging unlawful torture. He asserts, from his perspective in the book, that wasn't true. Legal officers assured him the methods did not constitute torture. So it's presented as a difficult decision made with legal review and based on a perceived need to prevent attacks.
Okay. Then there was that issue with the terrorist surveillance program, the TSP.
Right, another complex one. March 10th, 2004. He's told this program, authorized right after 9/11 and seen as vital, is facing a legal objection from the Justice Department and is set to expire that day.
Wow, talk about last minute.
Yeah, he describes being totally surprised, asking, how can it possibly end? Why didn't I know about this? He learned the objection was just to one specific component. So his decision was, okay, modify that part to meet the legal concern, but keep the core program going.
Did that work?
According to the book, yes. Comey and Mueller dropped their resignation threats, and the program continued to produce results, he says. But he describes being really disturbed it had happened at all, calling the whole standoff a case of bad judgment in terms of internal communication. Didn't want to be blindsided like that again.
Shows the internal friction, the communication challenges, even at that level during a crisis.
For sure. It's a glimpse into that.
Okay, so shifting to Afghanistan, the decision to go in there.
Yeah, the book notes that after 9/11, bin Laden often cited past U.S. withdrawals as proof Americans were paper tigers, lacking resolve. Bush writes he was determined to change that perception.
So a more aggressive approach.
That was the initial decision, yeah. Not just cruise missiles or limited bombing. Put boots on the ground and keep them there until the Taliban and al-Qaeda were driven out and a free society could emerge. The ultimatum to the Taliban was stark. Hand over the terrorists, or they will share in their fate. When they refused, it exposed their defiance, as the book puts it.
There's a poignant detail about the first bombs, isn't there?
Yeah, really powerful. On several of the first bombs dropped, the troops painted the letters FDNY, a direct link back to the firefighters lost on 9/11.
Wow. And Laura Bush's role is highlighted too.
Her commitment is definitely presented as a personal calling. Meeting teachers, entrepreneurs, helping get textbooks and medicine delivered, supporting the U.S. Afghan Women's Council. She made 3 trips herself. Shows that multifaceted approach being described.
Were there early signs of trouble mentioned, even with initial progress?
Yeah, progress reports showed schools reopening, economy growing, refugees returning, but underlying trouble is noted as persistent. The June 2005 Navy SEAL ambush, the lone survivor incident, is specifically mentioned, called the deadliest day of the war there, and for the SEALs since WWII, a real low point.
So despite those challenges, and knowing Iraq was coming, he decided to increase the commitment in Afghanistan.
Yes. He writes he decided America had to take on more responsibility there. His reasoning, quite bluntly put in the book, damn it, we can do more than one thing at a time. So he ordered what the book calls a silent surge. Increased troops from about 21,000 to 31,000 over 2 years. More than doubled reconstruction funding, beefed up provincial reconstruction teams, expanded the Afghan National Army, counter-narcotics, intel efforts, sent in civilian experts. It's presented as a decision to double down, believing they could manage resources for both fronts.
And the main source of the trouble was seen as coming from Pakistan.
Primarily, yeah, specifically the border areas. He mentions admiring President Musharraf's difficult decision to side with the U.S. after 9/11, noting the huge personal risks Musharraf took, facing at least 4 assassination attempts.
Right.
But there was tension. The book describes a Rose Garden dinner where he had to push Musharraf and Afghan President Karzai, who were apparently bickering about where terrorists were hiding, telling them to find common ground because the stakes were just too high. Shows that challenge of managing allies.
Okay, now let's turn to the Iraq War. The sources detail the lead-up, the decision-making described in the book.
Right. It mentions early discussions, like with the Gerhard Schroeder about the axis of evil comment. Then a key strategy session with Tony Blair in January 2003. They discuss Saddam Hussein violating UN Resolution 1441.
And Blair wanted a second UN resolution.
Yeah, for military and political protection back home. Bush agreed to try for one, seeing it as, quote, how best to help our friends, even though many of his own advisors were against it. So that decision is framed as prioritizing an ally's political needs.
Did he seek outside opinions before the final decision?
He describes doing that, yeah. Talking to scholars, dissidents who'd suffered under Saddam, Ali Weisel is mentioned specifically, describes the passion in his 74-year-old eyes comparing Saddam to the Nazis. Weisel argued there's a moral obligation to act, saying, though I oppose war, I am in favor of intervention when no other option remains.
So the moral dimension was considered, as presented here.
That's definitely highlighted as part of the consideration in the book.
What about post-war planning? Does the book address the challenges there?
It does discuss them, yeah. Mentions intelligence predicting Saddam's army and police would just switch sides, which led to plans to use those existing forces in the new Iraqi structure, an assumption that turned out to be wrong. A presidential directive, NSPD-24, created the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, ORHA, based in the Pentagon, led by Jay Garner, tasked with recruiting civilian experts.
Does the memoir acknowledge the limitations?
It does mention an awareness of limitations, states the U.S.'s nation-building capabilities were limited, and references that old saying, no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy, noting it was doubly true of a plan for the post-war environment. Suggests an acknowledgement of the difficulty even while presenting the invasion decision as necessary.
And the battle plan itself?
Ready by March 2003, developed by Tommy Franks. Aimed for swift, decisive overthrow, minimizing loss. The big unknown was still whether Turkey would grant access for the 4th Infantry Division.
And Saddam rejecting the exile option.
That's noted. His last known act described as ordering a dissident's tongue cut out, reinforcing the book's portrayal of his brutality. The memoir states, the dictator of Iraq had made his decision. He chose war. Bush describes giving the order to launch Operation Iraqi Freedom from the Situation Room.
And Saddam's capture later.
He recounts getting the call from Rumsfeld and Tenet on December 13, 2003, emphasizes the need for 100% certainty before announcing it.
Does the book offer Saddam's perspective after capture?
It includes something interesting, yeah. Apparently, he told FBI debriefers he was more worried about looking weak to Iran by giving up weapons programs than about a U.S. invasion. Said he never thought the United States would follow through.
Huh. And that's used to support the rationale.
Seems to be presented that way, yeah. Bush reflects on the clarity of the warnings given beforehand, the axis of evil speech, the UN speech, the unanimous Security Council resolution, bipartisan congressional backing, deploying 150,000 troops, the final 48-hour notice. Presents these as steps taken to avoid war, but ultimately facing a choice Saddam made.
So, looking back in the memoir, he stands by the decision.
Strongly.
States his belief it was the right decision. Argues America is safer because a hostile regime with a history of using WMD was gone. Says the region is more hopeful with emerging democracies and the Iraqi people are better off. Adds that hostile nations saw the cost of aggression and 25 million Iraqis got a chance at democracy a lot more than they'd had before. That's the book's stated rationale and conclusion.
Okay. But the post-invasion challenges were immense. How are those described?
Vividly. Shows the complexity right after the initial military success. Watching Saddam's statue pulled down, he recounts feeling overwhelmed with relief and pride, but also immediately mindful of the challenges ahead. Remaining regime forces, the Fedayeen Saddam militia, Saddam and his sons still on the run.
Right.
He notes telling Spain's Prime Minister Aznar, you won't see us doing any victory dances or anything. Suggests an awareness, even then, of the tough road ahead. But he also states his confidence in the troops and the Iraqis, mentioning 100,000 volunteers for security forces, leaders stepping up, ordinary people wanting freedom. Capturing or killing the regime figures was a priority.
Big priority. The killing of Uday and Qasem Hussein is detailed 6-hour firefight after an intel tip, troops under David Petraeus.
And there's a chilling detail about Saddam's reaction.
Yeah, the source notes receiving intelligence that Saddam, while still at large, ordered the killing of Barbara and Jenna in retaliation for his son's deaths, shows that really personal, brutal dimension of the conflict.
God. There's also a moving story about a wounded Marine becoming a citizen.
Yeah, really powerful anecdote. witnessing Marine Lance Corporal O.J. Santa Maria, originally from the Philippines, taking the oath of citizenship while literally hooked up to a blood transfusion after being wounded in Iraq. He powered through it, breaking down in tears. The book uses it to illustrate the stakes, the sacrifice, the character of those serving.
Wow. Okay, let's talk about this surge decision in 2006, 2007. That's presented as a crucial turning point, right? Driven by deteriorating conditions.
Absolutely. Made necessary by how bad things had gotten. The numbers were stark. Average 120 Iraqis dying daily, over 2,500 Americans lost by summer 2006. Approval ratings, his and the war's, were really low.
Everyone saw the need for a change.
The whole national security team shared concerns about the path they were on. Steve Hadley, the national security advisor, is highlighted as being key in helping find a solution. Described as scholarly, logical, thoughtful, steady, knew how to implement decisions. The kind of advisor you need at a moment like that.
What was the existing plan?
General Casey was planning something called Operation Together Forward. Clear, hold, build, with Iraqi forces taking the lead. But Bush notes seeing a contradiction because some generals also wanted to reduce the U.S. footprint. He pointed this out to Casey, who apparently just replied, "You do?"
Disconnect there.
Seems like it. Bush calls the summer of 2006 the worst period of my presidency. Shows the immense pressure. He tells a story about walking with Army Staff Sergeant Christian Bagg, who'd lost both legs. Marvels at his strength. His spirit bag didn't see himself as a victim, was proud of his service. A personal encounter that apparently reinforced Bush's resolve not to accept defeat.
So the core decision point came in late 2006.
Yeah, a meeting with the Joint Chiefs in the Tank, their secure conference room, in December 2006. He was there specifically to hear their opinions on military capacity. Pete Schoonmaker and James Conway recommended increasing the overall size of the Army and Marines.
And Bush's thinking at that point.
He summarizes it bluntly in the book. The surest way to break the military would be to lose in Iraq. That framing reveals the priority preventing failure was paramount in his view.
Okay. He delayed the announcement, though.
Yeah, delayed the formal announcement so Bob Gates, the incoming defense secretary, could visit Iraq first and make his own assessment.
What about Iraqi buy-in? Was Maliki on board?
That was critical. A secure video conference with Prime Minister Maliki in January 2007 is described. Bush told him essentially, "I'll put my neck out if you put out yours." Linking the U.S. surge to Maliki's willingness to crack down hard on militias, regardless of sect. Maliki signaled his commitment 2 days later. The book presents that as a necessary piece falling into place.
So he felt confident he'd made the decision the right way.
He states that, yeah, gathered facts, opinions, challenged assumptions, weighed the options, knew the surge would be hugely unpopular short term, but writes he hadn't given up on achieving victory.
And the reaction was hugely negative, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, described as swift and one-sided. The book includes quotes from senators calling it the most dangerous foreign policy blunder since Vietnam. From the left, things like a fantasy-based escalation, which could only make sense in some parallel universe where pigs fly and fish commute on bicycles.
Pretty harsh.
Very harsh. The book contrasts that reception with the conviction presented that it was the necessary military move.
Who led the surge on the ground? Petraeus and Crocker.
Right, the new command team. He met with them in February 2007. Told Petraeus, "This is it. We're doubling down." Petraeus' reply is quoted, "Mr. President, I think it's more like all in."
Wow. High stakes.
Totally. Petraeus took command, describing the situation as exceedingly challenging, stakes very high, the way ahead hard, but adding that crucial line, hard is not hopeless. Mission is doable.
And Ryan Crocker, the ambassador.
Described as gaining respect quickly, had a knack for spotting problems, blunt but with wry humor, worked seamlessly with Petraeus and earned the Iraqis' trust. Highlights the importance of that civilian-military partnership.
Was there a civilian component to the surge, too?
Yes, that was key. Doubled the provincial reconstruction teams, the PRTs, bringing military and civilian experts together. The book mentions impressive team leaders, combat vets, a female foreign service officer whose son served as a Marine, described their projects supporting a local newspaper, setting up courts, soil testing labs, stuff critical to counterinsurgency.
Did the political climate shift as the surge showed results?
The book points to Petraeus and Crocker testifying again in April 2007. Notes that this time, there were no anti-war ads in the newspapers, and NBC News stopped calling the situation a civil war. Petraeus recommended continuing withdrawal to pre-surge levels, then pausing, calling gains fragile and reversible. Crocker stated, "How we leave will be more important than how we came. Our current course is hard, but it is working." Bush writes he agreed with them.
And his final trip to Iraq, signing the agreements.
Yeah, December 2008, his fourth trip, to sign the Status of Forces Agreement, SOFA, and the Strategic Framework Agreement, SFA, with Maliki. He reflects on the arc of his visits: joy in 2003, deep uncertainty in 2006, cautious optimism in 2007, and now this final trip with a prospect of success, even though he felt much of America had tuned out.
And that's when the shoe-throwing incident happened?
That's the one. He recounts it. Describes seeing the first shoe fly, ducking, then the second. Waved off Secret Service, didn't want to be rushed out and make the guy a martyr. Looked at Maliki, who looked horrified. Iraqi reporters humiliated.
What did he do?
Held up his hands, urged calm, and made a point of trivializing it with a factual detail. If you want the facts, it's a size 10 shoe that he threw. Hoping, he writes, to keep the incident from ruining the event and overshadowing the progress represented by the agreements.
Quick thinking under pressure again.
That's how it's presented, yeah. The SOFA and SFA are seen as paving the way for departure, and the political blowback he feared for signing them didn't happen.
Okay, shifting gears a bit, let's talk key domestic policies mentioned in the sources.
Yeah.
No Child Left Behind, NCLB.
Right. Worked on through the fall after 9/11. A deliberate decision to keep pushing domestic priorities despite the crisis. Ted Kennedy's courageous speech defending accountability is highlighted as key to getting bipartisan support.
Even from Republicans who initially opposed the debt of education.
Yeah, like Judd Gregg and John Boehner, who'd once wanted to abolish it. The central argument presented for NCLB was simple. If we're spending this money on schools, we ought to know the results it produced. It passed by a bipartisan landslide, framed as a major legislative win based on conviction and cross-party work.
What about the Medicare prescription drug benefit, Part D?
The Medicare Modernization Act of 2003, presented as recognizing the old system lacked market forces, no consumerism, competition, transparency, little incentive to control costs.
Is there a human story attached to that?
Yeah, the example of Mary Jane Jones, who had to reuse insulin needles. The estimate was the new benefit would save her $2,700 a year. Passing it in the House was incredibly close, just 5 votes, after intense last-minute lobbying, called a miracle of miracles, highlights a complex legislative decision driven by market principles and a desire for tangible benefits, as presented here.
Then there was the attempted Social Security reform. That didn't go so well.
No, called the third rail of American politics, politically deadly to touch. Bush says he hugged it anyway because he believed it was unfair to make a generation of young people pay into a system that is going broke.
Why was it going broke, according to the book?
Demographics. Life expectancy way up, birth rate down. Result: only about 3 workers paying in for every beneficiary compared to 40 when it started in 1935. Just unsustainable math.
But he couldn't get the support.
Needed strong Republican backing, he notes, but didn't have it. Few were willing to take the political risk. The collapse of that reform effort is called one of the greatest disappointments of his presidency. An admission of failure on a key priority, blaming political caution for blocking a needed decision, in his view.
And immigration. Another tough one.
Yeah, described as a problem just getting worse. An underground industry of coyotes, tragic deaths, laws undermined, human rights violated. The economy needed workers, he writes, but there was no practical legal way for many immigrants to enter. He took it on in the 2000 campaign, confident a rational solution could be found, a decision based on conviction about rule of law, economics, and human dignity.
Okay, let's talk about the Katrina response. August 2005. The book is quite frank about the failures there, isn't it?
Very frank. Admits the primary issue wasn't making the wrong decisions, but that he took too long to decide on key federal actions. He addresses the perception issue, people thinking he didn't care, saying it was perception, not reality. His heart broke. He was outraged that the most powerful country in the world could not deliver water. It's framed as a failure of execution and coordination, definitely not intent.
The scale of the disaster was immense.
Unbelievable. The context of the Stafford Act is mentioned. Federal help follows state-local requests. He notes Joe Albaugh, who he'd put at FEMA after 9/11, had worked well then, but Katrina. The scale was just different. 80 miles of Mississippi coast obliterated. Gulfport under 10 feet of water. Waveland 95% destroyed, looks like when a nuclear bomb explodes, he writes.
And the levee breaches in New Orleans.
Yeah, water pouring in. Tens of thousands hadn't evacuated. And then the lawlessness. Some police abandoning posts, even joining looters. He says he was enraged seeing footage of police stealing TVs, the total reverse of what had happened 4 years earlier in New York, where police ran towards danger.
Getting federal troops in was a problem.
Huge frustration described there. Cites a resistant governor, a reluctant Pentagon, and an antiquated law about using military domestically. He worried about a potential constitutional crisis, possibly a political insurrection, if order wasn't restored fast.
So he pushed hard for action.
Convened a Situation Room meeting on day 5, saying urgently, "It's not cutting it, we have to establish order," presented as a decision point driven by sheer desperation.
Did he take responsibility?
Describes appealing to Governor Blanco on Air Force One, but she dug in, wouldn't give a clear answer on federalizing the Guard, limiting federal options, touring the flooded city, staring into the breach, horrific impact. In his speech from Jackson Square, he made a clear decision to take responsibility. "I, as president, am responsible for the problem and for the solution." Ordered a review to learn lessons. It's a raw look at decision-making chaos during a massive domestic disaster.
Okay, moving beyond immediate crisis and war, the sources discuss broader global engagement. Global health, PEPFAR, seems like a major focus.
Huge focus, presented as a key legacy initiative. PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. He describes seeing the suffering firsthand at a clinic, the Teso Clinic, in Uganda. Seeing patients, despite everything, reaffirming the dignity of life. This experience is directly linked to the gospel phrase, "To whom much is given, much is required." That became his motivation, his decision to make AIDS in Africa a central foreign policy element.
Did you work with others on it?
Yeah, mentions meeting Kofi Annan, finding common ground. Annan suggested the Global Fund model. Bush then proposed a massive $15 billion initiative, presented as the largest international health program ever for a specific disease. He calls PEPFAR a medical version of the Marshall Plan.
Are there personal stories connected to it?
Definitely. Meeting individuals like Muhammad Kalisubila and Agnes at that Teso clinic, Agnes urged him for more medicine. Later, he describes her helping nurse patients back to health using PEPFAR drugs. Muhammad and Agnes even came to the White House in 2008. Shows that personal connection he felt to the policy.
And the Bono connection is mentioned too.
Yeah, meeting Bono. Describes him as warm to the family, having genuine faith, edgy but not cynical. Importantly, Bono pushed for results, a measurable results guy. Bush includes an anecdote where Bono later apologized for doubting him when PEPFAR started slow. And after the program was distributing tons of condoms, Bono asked if the U.S. was now the world's largest purchaser. Highlights the sheer scale. It shows a major global initiative presented as stemming from personal conviction and strategic partnerships.
Relationships with world leaders are obviously key in decision-making too.
Absolutely crucial. Meeting Tony Blair first at Camp David is framed as honoring the special relationship. They watched Meet the Parents, which Bush apparently felt confirmed they'd get along, shows how personal chemistry mattered.
Who else is mentioned?
Jacques Chirac of France, Vladimir Putin of Russia, key counterparts. Gerhard Schroeder of Germany, described as relaxed, affable, appreciated for his help on Afghanistan, despite the Iraq disagreement.
What about Putin? How's he described?
Complex terms. Sometimes cocky, sometimes charming, always tough. Met over 40 times, visited each other's homes. Notes Putin's reaction to the Oval Office. My God, this is beautiful. But also recounts a tense talk about Georgia where Bush called Putin cold-blooded, right after Putin said he was hot-blooded too. Russia definitely stands out in the book as a disappointment regarding the freedom agenda Bush pushed.
Others? Japan, Saudi Arabia.
Junichiro Koizumi of Japan, noted for unwavering support after 9/11. The book highlights the irony. Their fathers fought in WWII, now the sons work together for peace. Japan seen as a powerful example of freedom's ability to transform enemies into allies. Saudi Crown Prince Abdullah, on the other hand, described as angered by Israeli violence, frustrated with Bush on Mideast policy. Shows the challenges even in long-standing alliances.
The freedom agenda itself, how's that presented?
Articulated in his second inaugural. America's vital interests and our deepest beliefs are now one. Called both idealistic and realistic in the book. Idealistic freedom as a universal gift. Realistic because he believed promoting democracy was the most practical way to protect our country in the long run by tackling extremism's roots.
Is there an example of it working, according to the book?
The Cedar Revolution in Lebanon is presented as a key success. When the Lebanese president unconstitutionally extended his term, Chirac and Bush co-sponsored UN Resolution 1559 demanding Syria withdraw. After Rafik Hariri was assassinated, evidence pointed to Syria. The U.S. recalled its ambassador, supported a UN investigation.
And Syria withdrew.
They did, March 2005. People celebrated, saying they wanted to be free. The book emphasizes this happened through diplomatic pressure, no American military involvement, presented as validating the agenda's potential beyond just military means. Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, with Abbas's election, are seen as having potential at that point for a freer, more peaceful region, though the difficulty is acknowledged.
What about dealing with regimes like Iran and North Korea? Those must have involved tough decisions.
Extremely tough. Iran, noted as governed by radical clerics, top state sponsor of terror, but also having a budding freedom movement. European, Russian, Chinese concern over Iran's nuclear program is mentioned. The diplomatic challenge was getting everyone to agree on sanctions.
His avoiding World War III comment is mentioned.
Yeah, linked directly to preventing Iran from getting the knowledge necessary to make a nuclear weapon, frames the diplomacy as a high-stakes decision to stop a potential catastrophe.
Did the 2007 intelligence estimate complicate things? The one saying Iran stopped weapons design work?
Hugely complicated things, according to the book, undermined the diplomatic effort, tied his hands militarily by making action harder to justify internationally. He notes being as angry about it as you are when discussing it with others who felt blindsided, mentions Saudis being too polite to confirm their suspicion aloud.
And the Israeli strike on the Syrian reactor.
Mentioned in 2007, notes Olmert's execution of the strike made up for the confidence I had lost in the Israelis during the Lebanon War the year before. Bush respected Olmert's wish for secrecy about the strike, even though he personally thought they missed a chance to politically isolate Syria by not revealing it immediately. Shows a decision to defer to an ally on operational security.
Okay, North Korea.
Persistent problem under Kim Jong-il. Book notes he broke his word not just to the U.S., but to neighbors like China, too. Firing missiles in July 2006 described as a military failure, but the provocation was real, linked to Kim Jong-il craving attention, testing the coalition.
How did he handle China on that?
Recounts calling Hu Jintao, telling him bluntly Kim Jong-il had insulted China with the launches. Notes his public statement was pretty mild, though. The six-party talks are presented as the best short-term bet for leverage, but his conviction, stated again, is that the only path to meaningful change is for the North Korean people to be free. Ties back to the freedom agenda.
Dealing with China was sensitive.
Very sensitive on the freedom agenda. His policy, as described, engage where possible to build trust, then speak plainly on differences. Mentions an early rough start with China. The EP-3 collision in 2001, U.S. Navy plane forced down, crew held. A tense time reminded him of the Iran hostage crisis, highlights that constant balancing act in foreign policy decisions.
Finally, let's talk about the 2008 financial crisis. How is navigating that presented?
As a series of incredibly high-stakes decisions under extreme pressure. He describes realizing the severity from Hank Paulson's urgent call and Ben Bernanke comparing it to the 1930s Great Depression, warning it could get worse fast.
How did he react personally?
Writes he was furious the situation had reached this point, blames Wall Street gambling, the housing market bust, realized this was not a normal environment, the market had ceased to function.
And the decision to intervene, the bailout?
Presented as a terrible choice between bad options. The consequences of doing nothing seemed catastrophic. He states it would be even more unfair to let the economy collapse and people suffer than to use taxpayer money for a bailout. A really difficult calculus. His core decision, get to work, approved Hank Paulson's plan. Describes walking to the Oval Office right after being briefed, Bernanke's 1930s comparison still echoing, underscores the gravity he felt.
What does the book cite as causes?
Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac get mentioned fueling the market for mortgage-backed securities, being private companies with congressional charters and lax regulation. Investors believed their paper had an implicit government guarantee. American banks using way too much leverage, borrowing heavily and loading up on these risky assets.
Key events mentioned. Bear Stearns.
Yeah, the Bear Stearns collapse. Fed Treasury action aimed to protect the system, not reward bad decisions, emphasized that Bear employees and shareholders took big losses.
Getting Congress on board for TARP was tough.
Extremely tough. The Troubled Asset Relief Program describes a critical meeting with congressional leaders in September 2008, Obama, McCain, Pelosi, Reid, McConnell, Boehner, all there.
Obama, McCain, mid-campaign.
Yeah. Obama accepted graciously, saying, anytime the president calls, I will take it. A moment of bipartisan cooperation in crisis. Bush recounts talking to McConnell and Boehner about how hard it was to get House Republican votes, telling them bluntly it would be a disaster if Republicans killed TARP and the economy tanked. shows the intense political negotiation needed.
What about the auto industry?
Congress had passed a loans bill for fuel efficiency, which Obama signed. Bush hoped Congress would release those loans immediately so the companies could survive until the next administration took over. Framed as a bridging decision. Carlos Gutierrez, Commerce Secretary, is mentioned as the point man. His story from delivery driver to Kellogg's CEO used to highlight his competence during the crisis.
And does the book offer lessons learned from the crisis from his perspective?
Yeah, his takeaways are listed. Convert Fannie Freddie to truly private companies. Banks need sensible capital requirements. Credit rating agencies have to reevaluate their models. Boards need to end compensation packages that incentivize excessive risk.
Any cautions?
Cautions against overcorrecting with regulations, believes that slows investment, stifles innovation. Argues government should unwind its involvement in the financial system. Congress shouldn't infringe on the Fed's independence. And stresses the crisis shouldn't be an excuse to raise taxes. Those are presented as his conclusions from navigating it.
Okay, the book concludes with reflections on leaving office, right? The final morning.
Yeah, a period of transition after 8 years of constant decision-making. Describes taking the elevator down, walking to the Oval Office one last time, Josh Bolton greeting him, "Mr. President, thank you for the privilege of serving."
Must have felt strange.
He describes the building as eerily quiet. No ringing phones, no television sets, no meetings, just the occasional buzz of a workman's drill, refitting the offices for a new team. A really poignant image of the job ending.
And the inauguration of Barack Obama.
Described simply. Taking his seat at the Capitol, marveling at the peaceful transfer of power, that cornerstone of American democracy. Notes the crowd's anticipation. Reflects that Obama campaigned on hope, and that was what he had given many Americans.
Leaving Washington.
A warm farewell ceremony at Andrews Air Force Base. Boarding the plane, now designated Special Air Mission 28,000, not Air Force One anymore since he wasn't president. Then landing back home in Midland.
Full circle.
Exactly. Beautiful West Texas winter day. Driving to a rally at Centennial Plaza where they'd had a send-off 8 years before. Seeing many of the same faces, a reminder of true friends.
What did he say in his speech there?
It is good to be home, and Texas never left us. Said he was leaving with the same values I brought 8 years ago, and no regrets about what I see except maybe the gray hair. A touch of humor after all the wait.
And adjusting to the afterlife, as he calls it.
Yeah, flying to the ranch in Crawford. Waking up at dawn the next morning, struck by the sheer calm. Says he felt like he'd gone from 100 miles an hour to about 10. Describes having to consciously force himself to relax. Instinctively thinking how we, meaning his administration, would respond to something in the news, then remembering, nope, that decision's on someone else's desk now.
That must be a huge mental shift.
Huge. Offers a real insight into what that's like after holding that kind of power.
The book ends with acknowledgments.
Lots of thanks to the people who served with him. Dick and Lynn Cheney, cabinet, staff, campaign teams, Texas governor's office folks, Secret Service, military aides, residence staff, medical unit, flight crews, Camp David team. And specific thanks for the dogs, Barney, Spot, Miss Beasley, and the people who cared for them. Another personal touch.
And the George Howard badge story?
Yeah, mentions carrying the badge of George Howard, a Port Authority police officer killed on 9/11 for 2,685 days, presented as this vivid, constant, physical reminder of that day and the reason he felt he had to fight on. He reflects that for younger Americans, future generations, 9/11 will probably become more like Pearl Harbor Day, an honored date. Not a scar on the heart, not a reason to fight on. Just a reflection on how history evolves from lived experience to memory.
So we've really covered a lot of ground here. Traveled through these key decisions as they're presented in this source, from the early years, shaping the person, through the huge challenges of the presidency. Crisis, war, domestic policy, global stuff, the economy, and then looking back.
Right, and our goal, just to reiterate, wasn't to judge these decisions ourselves, but really to understand them as presented through the specific lens of the decision maker in this memoir, trying to extract the insights offered about how these choices were made, the context, the advice, the rationale given.
And hopefully this deep dive gives you, our listener, a more informed perspective, quickly but thoroughly, by pulling out those key nuggets about decision-making under intense pressure.
Yeah, looking at these specific decisions framed this way in the book really does show how context, conflicting advice, personal history, core beliefs, and just unexpected events constantly collide when you're operating at that level.
So thinking about everything we discussed today, based only on these sources, what can you learn from seeing the world through this lens of high-stakes decision-making? where knowledge, values, relationships, and the totally unexpected are always crashing together.
And maybe what does that description of the transition going from 100 miles an hour to about 10 really reveal about the sheer intensity, the unique nature of that particular job itself? Something to think about.